Biological Riley presents The Ewoks Are Alright. Star Wars Return of the Jedi has the unfortunate distinction of being most people's least favorite original trilogy era Star Wars movie. While the film is still a good and fun adventure on its own, Return of the Jedi runs into a problem that many final chapters of acclaimed cinematic trilogies face. The one where a decent yet flawed third adventure follows two movies that are basically perfect. After all, the original Star Wars movie was a watershed moment for cinema, and its sequel, The Empire Strikes Back, is often regarded as the best Star Wars movie of them all, regardless of era, because it's The Empire Strikes Back. It is the movie equivalent of sliced bread, whereas the imperfect Return of the Jedi is the cinematic equivalent of blue titty milk. It's decidedly unsexy, but is still probably decent enough. Yum. There are a few reasons as to why many people knock down Return of the Jedi a few pegs, one of them being how the movie is lighter in tone. And we can see this by comparing Return of the Jedi to The Empire Strikes Back. See, The Empire Strikes Back was darker and more adult. It was a story where the bad guys won. In fact, by the film's end, Han Solo was frozen in carbonite and taken to Jabba's palace, and Luke lost his arm, as well as his fight with Darth Vader, as well as his innocence regarding his family tree. Because wow, if someone would have benefited from a genealogy test, it would be anyone who has Skywalker for a last name, as well as anyone named Rey. And with that, The Empire Strikes Back was tonally more adult. Sure, it still had the feel of an adventurous swashbuckler, but by the conclusion, the film was a more mature go-around, something that Return of the Jedi, unfortunately, walks back. In fact, on a narrative and thematic level, Return of the Jedi is far less adventurous than its predecessor. It repeats a similar plot twist with how Luke is related to another major character, but is much less effective. It does a Death Star plotline again, and some of the comic relief and narrative developments are way too light in tone. See Boba Fett's facepalm-inducing death scene that feels as if it should have the laugh track of a 90s sitcom behind it, because for the most feared bounty hunter in the galaxy, that shit was embarrassing. But with that being said, Return of the Jedi's list of problems has a scapegoat. When it comes to all the film's litany of issues, there is one flaw that defines the critical conversation surrounding it, all to the point that this issue can basically be used as a shorthand for all the problems in the movie. And this said problem can be summed up in one word, by which I mean Ewoks. Yes, Ewoks, the cute, cuddly little alien Care Bears who know how to handle a sharp stick. See, the Ewoks are representative of many folks' criticisms in regards to Return of the Jedi as a whole. As stated earlier, the movie is often criticized for being a safer and more family-friendly affair than its much better predecessor, and the Ewoks embody that problem. After all, the critters are adorable and are clearly marketed towards kids in order to sell toys, meaning that the Return of the Jedi is an inherently lighter affair just by having the Ewoks in it. Thus why many a Star Wars nerd forsake these walking and talking fuzzy bear things, because to them the Ewoks are too childish and therefore should Ewok into oncoming traffic. Sorry, that wordplay was a stretch, wasn't it? I honestly don't feel too bad about it though. But many folks' criticisms against the Ewoks are misguided. In fact, the Ewoks aren't that major of a problem in and of themselves, and honestly, I have two reasons for this rationale. Firstly, the Ewoks in this film made creative sense. See, the Ewoks worked as an allegory for the Vietnam War, and to be more specific, the Viet Cong. After all, the Ewoks are an indigenous population dwelling within the jungle locale of Endor, and are not as militarily well equipped as their imperial invaders who are occupying their land, which, subtle. And thus they have parallels with the Viet Cong, though obviously the Viet Cong probably weren't thrilled about being represented by these incredibly merchandisable little fuzzballs, because obviously. But still, the Ewoks made sense in the film. As far as thematic representations in blockbusters go, you can see what the story was aiming for. It's pretty clear. Admittedly, many folks who criticize the Ewoks are aware of this little factoid. If anything, those aforementioned Ewok haters believe that this thematic representation actually supports their argument. See, the Ewoks weren't originally going to be Endor's indigenous race and rebel fighter stand-in. Instead, Endor was actually going to be Kashyyyk, i.e. the home of the Wookies. You know, the race that Chewbacca is, i.e. the super tall and super strong race that is prone to violence and willing to rip someone's arms out if they were to lose a match of space chess. Which, quick aside, if that garners that much much of an intense reaction, I'd hate to be the doctor that gives a Wookiee a colonoscopy. Good luck not pissing yourself in fear, doc. But anyway, back to the point, many folks believe that the Wookiees being present in this story would have been a better creative choice than the Ewoks. After all, the Wookiees would have allowed Return of the Jedi to be more adult and less cynically marketable to children, and would have made the narrative far less lighter in tone, and thus, as the argument goes, they should not have been replaced by the Ewoks. But here's the thing, the Wookiees don't make as much sense as the Ewoks here, especially when it comes to representing the Vietnam War and the Viet Cong, because let's be clear, the Ewoks are a far more notable underdog than the Wookiees, who, let me remind you, will make your arms go snappy snappy if you upset them too much. Unlike the Ewoks, the Wookiees don't have the appearance of being a pushover, and thus wouldn't be a planet the Empire would house the facility that shields their new galaxy-conquering superweapon. I mean, let's be honest here. If you were the Empire, would you rather occupy a planet and set up a base of operations on a world of Wookiees, the race that is large and prone to violence, or would you rather take over and set up shop on a planet that is the home to little child-sized bears? The answer should be obvious. The Ewoks are clearly more outmatched on paper, and thus they make more creative sense here. The Empire wouldn't underestimate a Wookiee, but they would underestimate an Ewok, which is ultimately why the whole Vietnam allegory works better with the Ewoks rather than the Wookiees. This was on the mind of George Lucas as well. In fact, the original draft of A New Hope script, i.e. the first Star Wars movie, the climactic battle was supposed to be between the Empire and an alliance of primitive Wookiees, which was ultimately a creative idea that did not come to fruition, mostly because the costuming of the Wookiees was beyond the scope of the original movie's budget, and as a result, it was an idea left on the cutting room floor, just like how Jar Jar Binks should have been in Episode 1. But things eventually changed. See, when Lucas returned to Return of the Jedi, see what I did there? Lucas went back to this Wookiee idea, because by the time that he could cap the original trilogy off, the budget for his third film had been notably increased, and thus he could have his Wookiee battle on the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk. Lucas's ideal of a Wookiee battle could finally happen. Dreams indeed can come true, but there was a problem. See, the previous two movies in A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back established that Wookiees could clearly use galaxy-standard death weapons, understand space travel, fly spaceships, and such, and as a result, the Wookiees could hardly be described as technologically underexperienced underdogs that Lucas clearly desired for the conclusion of the first Star Wars movie. They no longer fit that role, hence why the Ewoks were created. Cute, cuddly, and seemingly non-threatening entities who actually have the capacity for some cutthroat guerrilla warfare, because once again, Viet Cong parallel. The Ewoks just fit the narrative here instead of the Wookiees. With that being said though, the Ewoks were designed in such a way as to be marketable to younger audiences, because sure, the Ewoks, not the Wookiees, make more sense in Return of the Jedi's story, but the Ewoks did not necessarily need to be designed in such a way that was clearly an attempt to sell toys and such. Like instead, they could have been aliens like tentacle monsters, trash gremlins, or the fucking Cat in the Hat, because that shit's terrifying. But no, Lucas and company chose the more monetarily lucrative avenue of basically selling miniature alien bears, because money was clearly a motivating factor. So yes, I understand why many folks would still rather have Endor be a planet of Wookiees. After all, Wookiees are cool as fuck, and even though the Ewoks make more logical sense from a creative angle, it is difficult to not be cynical about it. Like, the Ewoks were clearly firstly and foremostly put into the film because they were more marketable to kids and were less expensive to create costumes for compared to ones of Wookiees. Hell, they're basically walking and talking carnival-sized teddy bears. The Ewok-branded lunchboxes and underoos sell themselves. And with that, for many people, any logical reason as to why the Ewoks make more sense to exist in this movie than the Wookiees would is all a secondary rationale, because I admit, it's easy to overlook the Ewoks' artistic merit when they were firstly and foremostly put in this movie to save money on costuming and sell toys and other adjacent merchandise. I won't deny that a cynical view of the Ewoks is justified, even though I ultimately disagree, because creatively speaking, the Ewoks fits the narrative better, because once again, they represent the Viet Cong underdogs going up against an unjustified occupation by an imperialistic military force. The Ewoks Ewoks make more sense. Earlier in this essay, I discussed that there were two reasons as to why I disagree with the criticisms against the Ewoks. The first reason was the aforementioned creative merit, but the second rationale is that the Return of the Jedi has a bigger problem than just the Ewoks alone, and that issue is that this movie is horribly paced. In fact, this movie can be a drag at times. It can be slow, like a sloth mating ritual, because when it comes to sloths boinking each other, the sex is the foreplay. In other words, Return of the Jedi has bad pacing, particularly in the middle of the movie, i.e. the part where we are introduced to the Ewoks, though this also applies to the first act as well. See, Return of the Jedi starts as a slow burn. Events slowly unfold as we follow C-3PO and R2-D2, the Abbott and Costello of robots, as they infiltrate Jabba's palace, all before more characters like Leia, Chewbacca, Han, and Luke slowly but surely enter the film. It all happens over a lengthy pace. Admittedly, this alone is not a problem. After all, the other two movies in the original Star Wars trilogy start slowly as well. New Hope and Empire Strikes Back have minimal action within its first 30 to 45 minutes. Hell, A New Hope was similar to Return of the Jedi in that it mostly starts with the droids before slowly but surely accruing more and more of the main cast over time. And honestly, a slower first act can be good. It allows the audience to get their feet under them and get ingrained into a film's world, setting, and characters. It's basically cinematic indoctrination, but in a good way, a wholesome way. And truly, these slow first acts work well for setting up the action in these films. Hell, the slow burn aesthetic works for Return of the Jedi as well. The intrigue and drama within Jabba's palace is interesting, and the Sarlacc pit action sequence that is essentially the first act's capstone works wonders, save for that aforementioned Boba Fett death sequence where our dear Boba became the Sarlacc's num-nums, which was truly degrading for the character, though not as humiliating as the existence of the Book of Boba Fett, but still humiliating nonetheless. But despite that one issue, Return of the Jedi's opening act on its own is just as good as the opening acts of the other two original trilogy-era Star Wars films. It's honestly a very enjoyable opener and gets the viewer engaged, which is ultimately the point. But there is a problem with Return of the Jedi's slower start, especially when comparing it to A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. In A New Hope and Empire, the slow burns eventually gave way to some exciting cinema. After the Mos Eisley escape sequence in A New Hope, the second and third acts of that movie revolve around infiltrating and destroying the Death Star, and after an early slow start to Empire, we get the iconic battle for Hoth that eventually leads into Darth Vader utilizing the big bad Star Destroyer dubbed the Executor, which kinda sounds like a kinky BDSM thing, which is very befitting given who's at the helm, because Vader is clearly into some things. Just look at those buttons. Utilizing the Executor, Vader chases the Millennium Falcon across the galaxy, leading into a penultimate fight sequence in Cloud City, proving that slow, methodical beginnings can lead into strong second and third acts. But Return of the Jedi fumbles the ball here, like a kick returner for the Chicago Bears. After the terrific Sarlacc crime boss public execution action sequence, Return of the Jedi really slows down. In fact, between the end of the first act and the beginning of the third act, there is minimal action. There is a long lull, and much of the second act focuses on both introducing the Ewoks to the audience, as well as how Luke and the rest of the rebels try to convince the Ewoks to join the Rebel Alliance in the fight against the Empire, which takes up quite a bit of damn time and causes the movie to be at a standstill. Like seriously, I cannot state enough just how much of a drag Return of the Jedi's second act can be, and this is different from the first two movies. While sure, there was plot and narrative building moments in the second act of a movie like Empire, which honestly mostly describes Luke's training with Master Yoda, but there was still a lot of action in Empire's second act, given that Han Solo was leading the Empire through a Grand Theft Auto space car chase through a damned asteroid field that ultimately complemented the narrative and character development in a way that kept the movie's momentum going in full throttle. Because as stated before, The Empire Strikes Back is basically perfect, but Return of the Jedi's second act, and thus the Ewoks, lacked that similar type of cinematic movement going. It was dull. And honestly, the second act's narrative sluggishness when it came to introducing the Ewoks is the real reason why Return of the Jedi and the Ewoks plotline was lesser than anything else in the other two Star Wars movies that preceded it. While many people criticize the Ewoks in a justifiably cynical way, the only problem with the Ewoks is that they were tied to a dull second act. And sure, The Return of the Jedi's explosive third act picks up the slack, it is still a good movie overall after all. The somewhat boring second act was slow enough that it makes Return of the Jedi an overall lesser film compared to A New Hope and Empire, and ultimately the pacing, not the Ewoks themselves, are what truly makes it the least essential Star Wars movie in the original trilogy. It was a problem with the writing, more so than the Ewoks themselves, so maybe let's just cut the Ewoks some damn slack from now on. And with that, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like rating, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a comment telling me about your thoughts on the Ewoks. Also, please consider checking out my Patreon page. You can join for at least $1 a month, and $5 a month allows you to start making quick review requests. The link to my Patreon is in the description. And speaking of Patreon, I just want to thank my patrons, particularly my high tier ones in David, Samantha, Devlin, Mom, and Morgan. Thank you so much for supporting what I do. Love y'all.